A young black boy with dreams of becoming a great pilot soaring through the skies finally enters the prestigious pilot lounge at a renowned international airport ready to begin the internship program he has worked tirelessly to secure. But instead of encouragement, he is met with disdain from a white female pilot with over 20 years of experience. She believes he doesn't belong there, labels him an intruder, and calls security to kick him out. As the black boy stands there, stunned, humiliated, and alone, a powerful figure from the National Aviation Safety Board, NASB, enters the room, shocking everyone. The moment he speaks, the female pilot realizes her mistake is irreversible. Malik Anderson sat at the desk in his small room, the late afternoon sun streaming through the window. His desk was covered in airplane models, everything from the vintage Wright Flyer to the sleek lines of the latest Boeing 787. He'd spent countless hours assembling them, meticulously gluing each tiny piece, not just because he loved the craft, but because these planes represented his future. Malik Anderson was a 17-year-old boy. His frame was slender, almost delicate, with short, tightly coiled hair that framed his face, giving him a look that was both youthful and focused. His eyes, dark and earnest, were the kind that seemed to absorb everything around him, especially when he looked up at the planes that passed overhead, the jets that soared across the sky. He wore a simple, well-worn t-shirt and a pair of jeans, the typical attire of a teenager who had never known the kind of luxury that many of the pilots he admired had. His shoes, scuffed from long days walking the hallways of school and practicing his flight simulators, seemed far removed from the polished, high-end leather boots that many of the seasoned pilots he dreamed of becoming wore. From the time he was little, Malik had been obsessed with flight. At 6 years old, he could tell the difference between a 747 and a 737 simply by the sound of their engines. It wasn't just a hobby for him, it was his life. His father, Anthony Anderson, had always encouraged him, but also made sure Malik knew that this dream wouldn't be handed to him easily. Malik was not what people expected when they thought of a pilot, especially not the kind of pilots he often saw on TV, men and women in sharp, tailored uniforms, their smiles as polished as their shoes. They were often white tall and commanding the very image of authority and experience. In contrast, Malik looked like he had just stepped off the streets, like he was just starting his journey far from the polished professionals who inhabited the world of aviation. "You've got to earn it," Malik Anthony would say as he watched his son read through flight manuals at the kitchen table or spend hours on flight simulators late into the night. Anthony was a figure Malik had always looked up to, a towering man, both physically and in presence. He wasn't just his father, he was also a senior administrator at the National Aviation Safety Bureau, NASB, overseeing safety regulations and compliance across the nation. His job was demanding, often keeping him away on business trips, but whenever he was home, he would take time to sit with Malik, explaining the complexities of aviation and encouraging him to pursue his dreams. There were no shortcuts in the Anderson household. Malik's dream of becoming a pilot wasn't just born out of a love for planes. It was born from a deep-rooted desire to prove that someone like him, a black teenager from a modest background, could break through barriers. His father had instilled in him a belief that race should never determine what a person could achieve. "The sky's the limit, Malik. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." Anthony would say his words always carrying weight, shaping Malik's determination. It was that same drive that led Malik to pour his heart and soul into the application for the Skybridge Youth Flight Program, a prestigious career exploration program run by Sky Global Airlines. The competition was fierce. Hundreds of high school students across the country applied, but Malik knew this was his chance. He worked day and night on his application essay, crafting a narrative that combined his passion for aviation with a personal story about his father's influence and the dreams they shared. It wasn't just an essay, it was his ticket to the skies. Malik knew he was up against hundreds of other students, many from schools with better resources, better connections, and more opportunities. Some of them came from families who had deep ties in the aviation world, pilots, engineers, even CEOs of major airlines. Malik didn't have any of that. His family's modest home, the one filled with airplane models and late-night talks about the stars and the sky, was far removed from the high-end conference rooms or corporate offices where decisions like these were made. It was just Malik, his dreams, and the quiet encouragement of his father, Anthony, who was always there to remind him that while others may have more, his worth would be measured by his determination and his passion. The email finally came one cold November morning, the subject line reading, "Congratulations, Malik Anderson. You've been selected for the Skybridge Youth Flight Program." For a moment, Malik sat there staring at the screen in disbelief. His hand shook as he clicked open the message, and when he saw the words, "You have been chosen to represent your school in the program," it felt like the weight of the world had been lifted off his shoulders. It was a dream come true. This was what he'd been working for, the first step into the world of aviation. The day Malik left for Sky Global Airlines headquarters, his father drove him to the airport, their usual silence punctuated by soft words of encouragement. Malik could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him, but he didn't let it show. The drive to the airport was quiet, filled with the hum of the engine and the occasional murmur from his father. "You've got this," Malik Anthony said, his voice steady, but filled with the pride he felt for his son. "Just remember, this is your chance. Take it." Malik nodded, his heart pounding in his chest as he imagined what lay ahead. The warm sunlight filtered through the high windows of Sky Global Airlines International Airport, casting soft golden rays across the sleek floor of Terminal C. Inside the pilot's lounge, an exclusive space reserved for uniformed captains and authorized personnel, Malik sat quietly on a leather couch, his eyes wide with wonder reflecting the flickering light from a television screen that played a documentary on the evolution of supersonic aircraft. His skin was the rich brown of Southern Earth, and his tightly coiled hair was neatly trimmed, matching the sharp creases of his buttoned shirt. On his chest, a special ID badge glinted under the light, a sign of his hard-won place in Sky Global Airlines' prestigious Skybridge Aviation Career Exploration Program. Malik didn't look like he belonged to this sterile and polished world, at least not in the eyes of those who had never bothered to see beyond appearances. Yet in truth, no one in that lounge had fought harder to be there. Just a week ago, he had received the acceptance letter that made him scream with joy and fall into his father's arms. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a ticket to the skies, a validation of years spent dreaming, studying, drawing aircraft blueprints by hand, practicing flight maneuvers on home simulators, and writing essays fueled by passion, so intense it made the words almost burn off the page. Malik sat with his backpack on the floor beside him, the lanyard holding his badge securely around his neck, his foot tapping to the rhythm of the plane documentary's score, Ms. Clara Morales from the HR department had personally walked him into the lounge earlier that morning, smiled warmly, and told him to wait here while she attended to an urgent personnel meeting. Malik had nodded respectfully, taking her words to heart. He knew the importance of following rules, especially Bowie in places like this. And yet, despite all his preparation, he couldn't shake the mix of awe and disbelief swirling inside him. The pilot's lounge was quiet, with the muted hum of engines from the tarmac outside, and the occasional click of heels or suitcase wheels echoing through the corridor. Malik sat up straighter every time someone walked past his eyes, darting briefly to the entrance, hoping his mentor, or Tanya, would return soon. He didn't want to cause any trouble, he simply wanted to soak in the experience. This was his first time in a professional aviation environment, and just being in the same room as real pilots made his chest flutter with anticipation. He imagined himself here 10 years from now in full uniform, laughing with colleagues before takeoff, charting flight paths across continents. Malik closed his eyes for a moment, letting the voice from the documentary wash over him. The Concorde was the crown jewel of commercial speed, a feat of engineering that cut Atlantic travel time in half. The words blended with the memories of sitting on the hood of his father's car at the edge of the airport when he was younger, watching planes ascend into the clouds with awe and ambition glowing in his heart. His father, Anthony Anderson, had always told him, "Son, the sky doesn't care what color you are. It only cares how well you fly." That quote echoed now, anchoring him in the moment. He wasn't just sitting in the lounge. He was claiming a space he had earned. Malik knew that some people might look at him and see only a black kid in a pilot's lounge, perhaps even think he was lost. But he also knew what they couldn't see: the sleepless nights he had spent mastering aircraft systems, the scholarship essays he had rewritten 6 times, the recommendation letters from teachers who believed in him. His hands rested on his knees, fingers lightly drumming. Every fiber in his body buzzed with both purpose and restraint. He didn't touch anything, didn't wander around, just watched, waited, breathed. He respected the space because it represented his future, a future he was determined to reach, no matter what barriers might lie ahead. And yet behind that calm exterior, a flicker of anxiety pulsed just beneath the surface. Because deep down, Malik understood the tightrope he was walking. He had grown up learning that spaces like this didn't often welcome boys like him, not unless they could prove beyond all doubt that they belonged. That's why he had followed every instruction to the letter, made sure to carry his ID, and even practiced his answers in case anyone asked who he was. So when the metallic click of the lounge door echoed sharply and heavy heels tapped their way toward him, Malik turned his head slowly, expectantly, hoping it was Clara returning. But it wasn't. It was someone else. Someone who would not see the boy quietly watching aviation history unfold on a TV screen. Someone who wouldn't notice the pride on his face or the preparation behind his presence. Malik glanced up, his eyes meeting the cold, calculating gaze of Captain Deborah Voss, a veteran pilot with more than 20 years of experience at Sky Global. Her eyes narrowed as they swept over him, taking in the young black teenager sitting alone in the pilot's lounge. For a brief moment, her expression faltered, confusion flickering across her face. She took a step forward, her heels clicking sharply on the floor. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the calm of the room. Malik stood up instinctively, his heart skipping a beat. "Hi, ma'am. I'm Malik Anderson. I'm part of the Skybridge program. I'm just waiting for my guide to come back." Deborah's eyes darkened, a skeptical smirk playing on her lips. "Skybridge program. This is a restricted area. You shouldn't be in here without supervision." Malik tried to explain, but her sharp tone interrupted him. "I don't care what program you're in. This is for pilots, not kids." She reached forward and snatched his ID badge from around his neck before he could protest. The plastic strap snapped with a sharp sound as she turned the badge over in her hand, inspecting it with a critical eye. "This doesn't look legitimate to me," she said, her voice growing colder. "I'm calling security. There's an unauthorized intruder in the pilot's lounge. Get out now." Malik's heart raced as fear flooded his chest. His breath quickened, and he instinctively took a step back. But ma'am, it's real," he stammered, his voice trembling. "I was given this badge by Ms. Clara Morales from HR. She said I could wait here. I said get out," Deborah snapped, cutting him off. "Now." With a sense of growing panic, Malik tried to explain again, but the words wouldn't come. His throat tightened, and all he could do was stand there as Deborah dialed security, her actions betraying a cold, unspoken disdain. In that moment, Malik's dream, the very thing he'd worked so hard for, felt like it was slipping away. The room felt strangely quiet as Malik sat back down in his chair, the coldness of the moment pressing in on him. Captain Deborah Voss had already turned her attention away from him, her voice cold and dismissive as she spoke into her radio, summoning security without a second thought. Malik's heart was pounding, the sound of it thudding in his ears as he tried to make sense of what was happening. How had everything unraveled so quickly? One moment he was waiting in the pilot's lounge, dreaming about his future in aviation, and the next he was being treated like a criminal. Malik glanced down at the ID badge around his neck, the one he'd earned through hard work, the one that had allowed him to enter this space. His fingers trembled as they brushed over the plastic, but the sense of pride he'd felt earlier was now overshadowed by a deep unease. The thought that someone like Deborah could look at him and decide he didn't belong here simply because of his skin color felt like a punch to the gut. He had worked so hard for this opportunity, and now it was all slipping away. His dream of becoming a pilot, the future he had fought for, was hanging by a thread. A sharp click echoed through the room as Deborah's radio crackled again, her voice cutting through the stillness. "Security report to the pilot's lounge now," she said, her tone final, unwavering. "We have an unauthorized individual here, and I need assistance." The word stung. Unauthorized individual. Malik wasn't an intruder. He had every right to be here. This was his chance, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that he had earned. Yet standing here, he felt like the walls were closing in, as if he were an outsider in a world that should have welcomed him. He tried to swallow the lump in his throat, but the tightness in his chest only grew. He looked around the room, hoping someone would step in, someone who would understand, someone who would vouch for him. But the more he looked, the more he realized that the room was full of strangers. Pilots, airport staff, all of them watching him with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. No one came to his defense. No one said anything to challenge Deborah's harsh accusations. His eyes fell to the floor, and for a moment he was lost in the weight of the silence, the weight of the eyes on him. He wanted to speak, to explain himself, to tell them that he wasn't lying, that he wasn't some threat to their precious security, but the words felt stuck in his throat. He felt paralyzed, his mind racing, but his body frozen in place. How could he prove himself when no one was willing to listen? How could he explain the truth when it was clear that the truth didn't matter? A soft hum filled the room as the sound of footsteps drew closer. Malik's heart skipped a beat as he looked up, his eyes darting toward the door. The tension in the air seemed to thicken the atmosphere, heavy with the expectation of something, anything about to happen. He wasn't sure who was coming, but he knew that whatever it was, it wouldn't make things any easier. The door swung open and two security officers stepped inside. They were a middle-aged man and a younger woman, both in crisp uniforms that gave them an air of authority. They glanced at Malik, their eyes assessing him with the practiced scrutiny of professionals who had dealt with their fair share of disturbances. But there was something in their eyes, something that told Malik they didn't yet know what to make of him. He could feel the weight of their gaze, heavy and judgmental, as they took in his youth, his nervousness, his apparent discomfort in this place. The man whom Malik guessed was the senior of the two stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Young man," he said, his tone professional, but there was an edge to it, a hint of skepticism. "Please come with us. We need to verify your identity and clarify the situation." Malik opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He looked down at his ID badge again, but before he could find the courage to speak up, the woman officer moved toward him, standing just a few inches away, her arms crossed as she studied him. "Do you have any idea how serious this is?" she asked, her voice colder than her partner's. "You're in a restricted area. We don't take things like this lightly." Malik swallowed hard, his palms sweating as he clasped his hands together to steady them. "I didn't do anything wrong," he thought desperately. But the thought felt hollow, as if it didn't matter. He knew deep down that his word wasn't enough here. In this room, he wasn't a student on a career exploration trip. He was just an intruder, someone who didn't belong, someone who was already guilty in their eyes. "I didn't use a fake ID," Malik finally managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm part of the Skybridge program. Ms. Clara Morales from HR, she brought me in here. I've been waiting for her to come back." The woman officer didn't respond immediately, but her expression didn't soften. She didn't seem convinced, her gaze unwavering as she turned to her partner. They exchanged a brief look, one that spoke volumes. Malik could see it in their eyes. They didn't believe him. They thought he was lying. "Young man, we need to do a thorough check," the senior officer said, his voice matter-of-fact. "Please cooperate, and we can get this resolved quickly." Malik took a step back, his mind reeling. "I've done everything right," he thought. "Why won't they believe me?" He glanced toward the door, hoping that Clara would walk in at any moment, that she would be the one to explain, to clear everything up. But the minutes stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. There was no sign of her. He felt like a fly caught in a spider's web, his every move scrutinized, his every word doubted. His pulse raced, his stomach churned. "What if they don't believe me? What if this is it?" The questions echoed in his mind, drowning out everything else. Just then, the radio on the woman officer's belt crackled to life, breaking the silence. A voice came through, sharp and urgent. "Security, please report to the pilot's lounge. We need immediate assistance. There's a situation." Malik's heart skipped a beat. Is this it? Are they going to take me away now? He felt like the room was closing in on him, the walls pressing in with each passing second. He wanted to run, but his feet felt glued to the floor. Before he could react, the door swung open again. A figure stepped inside, and Malik's breath caught in his throat. His pulse quickened, and for the briefest moment, he thought he might be imagining things. But no, the man who had just walked in was unmistakable. He was tall, his features strong and resolute, his dark eyes filled with the kind of authority Malik had only ever seen in his own father. The man's presence filled the room like a storm, and for the first time that day, Malik felt something close to hope. But as the man moved forward, Malik's heart sank. There was no recognition in the officer's eyes, no sign that they knew who he was. To them, he was just another person, another intruder, and with every step they took toward him, Malik realized that his battle was far from over. The silence in the pilot's lounge was almost suffocating as Malik stood frozen, caught between the weight of his fear and the rising tide of frustration. The two security officers were still eyeing him with suspicion, their presence like an invisible wall between him and any hope of a quick resolution. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked from one officer to the other, trying to find some sign, any sign that they would believe him, that they would see the truth. But the officers' faces were cold, unyielding. They weren't looking for answers. They were looking for confirmation. Malik wasn't just a guest in their eyes anymore. He wasn't the eager, passionate teen who had worked so hard to get here. No, to them, he was a problem, an issue, something that needed to be resolved. His story didn't matter. His presence didn't matter. All that mattered was the accusation that had been leveled against him. "Where's Miss Morales?" Malik asked again, his voice trembling slightly despite his efforts to stay composed. He tried to make his words firm, but they came out with an edge of desperation. "She brought me in here. I'm supposed to be here. She's my guide." The male officer glanced at the woman officer, his face unreadable. The exchange between them was subtle but clear. Malik had no allies here. His explanation wasn't enough. The woman officer gave a curt nod, signaling the man to move forward. He stepped closer to Malik, his eyes narrowing as he studied him, his demeanor cold and businesslike. "We'll have to take you to security for a more thorough check," the man said, his voice flat, as though they had already made up their minds about him. "If you're really part of the program, it'll be cleared up soon enough. But until then, we need to verify your identity." Malik wanted to protest, to scream that this was wrong, that they had no right to treat him this way, but the words stuck in his throat. He could feel his legs trembling beneath him, his chest tight with the pressure building inside him. He had never felt so powerless, so small. Every time he opened his mouth to defend himself, it felt like he was being drowned out by the weight of their doubt, their suspicion, and worse, by the deep-seated prejudice that had crept into this moment without his consent. The woman officer stepped forward now, her voice laced with a hint of judgment as she spoke. "You really thought we wouldn't notice, didn't you? A kid like you walking into the pilot's lounge with an ID that looks off. You're lucky we're even giving you the benefit of the doubt right now." The sting of her words hit Malik like a slap, and he had to fight the urge to let the tears well up in his eyes. He could feel them threatening to spill over, but he held them back, clenching his fists at his sides. "I can't cry," he thought to himself. "Not now. Not in front of them. I'm not lying." Malik whispered, his voice barely audible. "Please, just call Ms. Morales. She'll tell you I'm supposed to be here." But the officers didn't seem to care. They had already made up their minds. The woman officer stepped closer, practically looming over him. "It's just a procedure," she said, as though that would make it all right. "You don't get to question us, kid. Just come with us and we'll sort this out." Malik wanted to argue, wanted to tell them that he had every right to be here, that he was not just a kid who didn't belong, but the words got lost in the overwhelming flood of emotions and the sharp, cutting reality that no one was listening to him. He wasn't part of their world. He wasn't one of them. He wasn't the type of person who was allowed to sit in the pilot's lounge to be treated like he belonged in this place. Not with his skin color, not with his background. He felt that deep in his bones, as though it was a truth that had been written into the world long before he was born. A soft click of the door echoed through the room, and Malik turned his head, hope flaring in his chest for a moment. But when the door opened, it wasn't Ms. Morales or anyone who could help him. It was just a group of other pilots walking past with barely a glance in his direction. They didn't even look at him as they moved through the lounge, their eyes trained on the floor or on their phones, focused on their own world. Malik's stomach sank. There was no one here to help him, no one to speak up for him. It was just him against the world, against the system, against the biases that had already been formed in their minds. He was alone. The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in on him as the weight of the situation settled over him. He was trapped. He had no way out. He had worked so hard to get here, but now, in this moment, it didn't matter. The world around him had already decided his place, and it was not here. It was not with the pilots, with the people who belonged in the sky. It was somewhere far below, somewhere where people like him were not allowed to dream. Malik could hear the officers talking now, their voices distant, but growing louder. They were discussing their next steps, the possibility of calling someone from higher up, maybe even taking him to a holding room until they figured out what to do. As he stood there surrounded by the cold indifference of the officers and the empty stares of the other pilots, Malik couldn't help but wonder if this was what his future would always be like. Would he always be the kid who didn't belong? Would his dreams always be out of reach because of the color of his skin? He thought back to his father's words, "You belong to the sky." But here, in this moment, it didn't feel that way. The sky felt so far out of reach, as if it had been reserved for everyone but him. The silence hung in the air for what felt like an eternity. Malik felt his resolve beginning to crumble, the weight of the injustice pressing down on him. But just as he was about to lose hope completely, he heard the sound of hurried footsteps down the hall. His eyes snapped toward the door, his heart leaping into his throat. This time, it wasn't a pilot or another airport employee walking past. It was someone who might be able to help him, someone who could make this nightmare stop. But even as the footsteps grew louder, Malik couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this fight was only just beginning. And no matter what happened next, he knew that it would be the fight of his life. He glanced at the clock on the wall. The minutes ticked by slowly each second, like a heavy stone being added to the burden he felt. His throat tightened as he looked back at the officers who were still observing him, not with the concern one would have for a student caught in a misunderstanding, but with the cold detachment reserved for someone who had already been found guilty. There was no empathy in their eyes. They didn't see him as a teenager trying to find his place in the world. They saw him as an intruder, someone who didn't belong here. The thought made Malik's stomach churn, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. What do I do now? The question gnawed at him. He had tried to explain, tried to show them that he was part of the Skybridge program. He had even pointed to his ID badge, but it seemed as though every word he spoke only dug him deeper into the hole he had been forced into. He wasn't allowed to be here. He wasn't allowed to dream. And the worst part was he wasn't sure how to get out of this situation. He felt like the walls were closing in on him, suffocating him. The dream he had fought so hard for seemed to be slipping away with every passing second. I need help, Malik thought desperately, his mind racing for a solution. He had to do something before this got worse. He couldn't let this be the end of his journey. Not like this. His thoughts raced back to his father, to Anthony Anderson, strong, confident, and unwavering. Dad would know what to do. Malik thought the words coming to him like a beacon in the dark. The only person who could save him from this nightmare was his father. He reached into his pocket, his fingers fumbling as he pulled out his phone, the device suddenly feeling heavier than it ever had before. With trembling hands, Malik dialed the familiar number, his heart pounding as he brought the phone to his ear. The seconds felt like hours as he listened to the ring on the other end, the sound sharp and endless. The line clicked, and Malik's breath caught in his throat. "Dad," he said, his voice barely a whisper, strained with panic. He had to choke back the fear, threatening to break through, but it was impossible to keep his voice steady. "Dad, I'm at the airport. They're saying I'm not supposed to be here. They're saying I don't belong in the pilot's lounge. I don't know what to do. Please, please help me." His words spilled out in a rush, each one laced with a desperation that was impossible to hide. There was a long pause on the other end, a silence so deep that it seemed to stretch across the miles separating them. Malik could hear his father's calm breathing, could feel the strength in that silence, and it gave him a momentary sense of relief. He knew that his father would know exactly what to do. Anthony Anderson had always been the rock Malik could rely on, the one person who would always have his back, no matter what. "I'm coming," Malik Anthony said after a moment, his voice clear and steady. "Stay right where you are. I'll handle this. Don't worry." Malik closed his eyes, letting out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Hearing his father's voice, hearing that reassurance, was like a balm to the raw wound of his fear. He felt a flicker of hope, but it was short-lived. The security officers had already begun to circle around him again, and their eyes were sharp cold. Malik could sense the judgment in the air, thick and suffocating. Before he could say another word, the woman officer who had been leading the charge took a step forward, her eyes narrowing as she glanced down at the phone in his hand. "Are you calling your parents?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief and condescension. "What do you think that's going to save you? You're not going anywhere, kid. We're just doing our job. This is a serious security breach. You don't belong here. And your parents, well, they're not going to be able to change that." Malik felt the sting of her words hit him like a slap to the face. It was as if everything he had worked for, everything he had dreamed of, had been reduced to nothing more than a joke. They saw him as an outsider, an intruder who didn't deserve to be here, no matter what his badge said. But as much as her words hurt, Malik didn't back down. He stood taller, holding his phone tightly in his hand. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let them take away his chance. Not like this. I don't care what you think, Malik said, his voice barely above a whisper, but it was strong, unwavering. My dad's coming, and when he gets here, you'll see I'm not the one in the wrong. The woman officer sneered, dismissing him with a roll of her eyes. But Malik didn't care. He knew his father would be here soon, and when he arrived, everything would change. The fear in his chest, the doubt that had been gnawing at him, began to recede as he held on to the thought of his father coming to his rescue. But even as hope began to settle in his heart, Malik couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about him anymore. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or an innocent mistake. This was bigger than that. It was about the system that was already stacked against him, about the prejudices that were so deeply ingrained in the people around him, people who would look at a young black teenager in a pilot's lounge and automatically assume he didn't belong. This was the world he was living in, the world that had shaped his dreams, and now in the blink of an eye threatened to crush them. He clenched his phone tightly, his hand slick with sweat, and whispered to himself, "Please, Dad, hurry. I need you now." As the door swung open, Malik's heart leapt into his throat, a sudden rush of relief flooding through him. He knew that step, that firm stride. It was his father, Anthony Anderson. His breath hitched as he turned toward the man entering the room. Anthony's tall, imposing figure immediately filled the space, and Malik felt the weight of his presence like a protective shield. The nerves that had clenched his stomach all this time began to loosen just a little. His father was here. Finally. For a moment, the room felt lighter. The suffocating tension, the cold stares of the officers, the feeling of being utterly alone, it all faded into the background. Malik was no longer the terrified teen trapped in a corner accused of a crime he didn't commit. He was just a son waiting for his father to make everything right. But as his father approached, Malik's sense of relief quickly morphed into confusion and dread. The officers didn't react with the warmth Malik had hoped for. Instead, their eyes flicked to Anthony with caution, suspicion written clearly on their faces. They had no idea who Anthony was. They saw a man in a sharp suit carrying the aura of authority and power that came with being from the National Aviation Safety Bureau, NASB, but they didn't understand the connection between Anthony and Malik. In their minds, Anthony wasn't here to help Malik. He was here to reinforce the accusation to back up their claims that Malik was a threat. Deborah Voss, still standing with her arms crossed, eyed Anthony with a mix of irritation and cold resolve. She had already made up her mind about Malik, and now she saw Anthony as just another figure of authority, another official, who would side with the security officers, furthering her belief that Malik was a liar, an intruder who didn't belong here. She stepped forward, her posture rigid with a false sense of superiority. "You must be here to help us," Deborah said, her voice dripping with condescension. "We have an intruder in a restricted area. He's obviously using a fake ID, and we need to handle this quickly." The male officer next to her nodded in agreement, his face stoic but betraying an edge of anxiety. The security guards seemed to grow more confident as they saw Anthony step in, assuming he was part of their side, the side of authority and security, ready to back up their decision. Malik's stomach twisted. His father didn't get a chance to speak, didn't get the opportunity to clarify who he was. Instead, the officers and Deborah treated him like another enforcer, someone who would help them rid the room of Malik. The harsh words and accusations against him continued as though Anthony's presence only fueled their need to put him down. Deborah, as if to punctuate her point, looked directly at Malik, her eyes narrowing with disdain. "You really thought a few tears and a phone call would save you? You don't belong here," she said, the bitterness in her voice cutting deeper than any of her earlier insults. Malik stood still, his heart sinking with every word. His father's silence was deafening. Why wasn't he speaking? Why wasn't he defending Malik, telling them that this was all a mistake? But then in the midst of the rising tension, it hit Malik like a sudden lightning strike. His father had waited for the right moment. He wasn't just here to watch from the sidelines, he was here to take control. Anthony stepped forward, his presence suddenly filling the room in a way that demanded attention. He didn't need to raise his voice. It was the authority in his every movement that silenced everyone. "This is my son," he said firmly, his voice sharp as it sliced through the noise. "Malik Anderson is my child, and I'll thank you to remember that before you continue with your baseless accusations." The room fell dead silent. Deborah's confident posture crumbled. Her mouth hung open slightly, the reality of the situation crashing into her as the words sank in. She stood frozen, her mind racing to process what had just been said. This wasn't just an ordinary official from the NASB. This was Malik's father, Alfiar. She blinked a few times, the shock of the revelation starting to unravel her certainty. The male officer who had been speaking to Malik earlier took a step back, his face now tinged with embarrassment. He had assumed that Anthony was just another bureaucrat sent to uphold the security measures, but now, with the truth so starkly laid out, he realized how badly they had misjudged the situation. Malik's chest tightened. For a moment, he thought he might collapse, the pressure of the situation and the sudden, overwhelming relief mingling inside him. But the tension in the room was far from over. It wasn't just the officers who were processing the shock. The air hung thick with disbelief, and even Malik's mind struggled to catch up to the reality of what had just happened. Deborah, unable to mask her discomfort, quickly tried to regain her composure, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, her eyes now flicking to the ground in guilt, but her next words were still sharp, still defensive. "I didn't know," she muttered, her voice faltering. "I didn't know he was your son. I was just following protocol. He didn't belong here." Anthony's expression didn't soften. He looked directly at her, his gaze unwavering. "Protocol doesn't justify treating a young man like a criminal based on assumptions. You didn't verify anything. You just decided he was guilty." His voice was calm, but the weight of his words hit Deborah harder than any accusation had before. "And that, Captain Voss, is what I find unacceptable." Malik's stomach churned the words, feeling like a heavy weight on his shoulders, but at the same time, something inside him began to shift. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he could feel the pressure starting to lift. His father was here, and his father wasn't going to let anyone continue to demean him. He wasn't going to let anyone take away what Malik had fought so hard to achieve. The silence in the room was thick, everyone frozen in place as the realization of what had just happened settled over them. The officers, the pilots in the room, even Deborah, all of them were now faced with the consequences of their actions. The wrong had been done, and it couldn't be undone. Malik stood tall, his body still trembling slightly from the earlier tension, but the anger in his heart began to burn. He wasn't the intruder here. He wasn't the one who had made the mistake. It was them. They had assumed, judged, and condemned him before giving him a chance to speak. And now, standing beside his father, Malik knew that this was just the beginning. He would stand his ground. He would fight for the respect he deserved. Deborah looked at him, her gaze now filled with a mixture of guilt and reluctant recognition. The same coldness that had been there moments ago was replaced by an awkward silence, as if the truth was too much for her to handle. The male officer who had spoken earlier seemed to shrink, no longer sure of what he should do next. It was as if they all realized they had been wrong, but were unsure how to move forward, unsure how to mend what had already been broken. Anthony took a step toward Malik, placing a hand on his son's shoulder in a gesture of solidarity. "You've done nothing wrong, Malik," he said quietly, the words a comfort to Malik's raw nerves. "And no one is going to take that away from you." In that moment, Malik understood something deeper than just the immediate relief of his father's arrival. It wasn't just about this single moment in time. It wasn't just about this misunderstanding. It was about a much larger fight. A fight against prejudice, against assumptions, against a system that tried to tell him that he didn't belong. And now, standing beside his father, Malik felt a fierce determination burn inside him. He wasn't just fighting for his place in the sky. He was fighting for his dignity, for his right to stand tall in this world, no matter how others saw him. As the gravity of the situation continued to hang heavy in the air, Malik couldn't help but feel the sharp sting of disbelief mingled with a strange sense of relief that his father had finally arrived. But even with Anthony standing beside him, Malik's nerves remained taut, his heart still racing, unsure of what would come next. The officers, the pilots, and Deborah, now all of them, seemed frozen, unable to make the next move. Their certainty had been shattered, but the underlying tension had not disappeared. The realization that Malik was Anthony's son hung between them like a heavy cloud. For a moment, the room was quiet, the silence stretching on as the weight of the truth settled in. Deborah Voss, usually so poised and authoritative, was now visibly shaken. The cold confidence she had carried into the room earlier had vanished. Her posture, once rigid, now sagged with embarrassment and regret. She stood there for a long moment trying to compose herself, but her eyes betrayed her inner turmoil. She had thought she knew who Malik was. She had thought she understood the situation, but now with Anthony's words cutting through the confusion, it was clear how wrong she had been. The realization of her mistake was almost too much for her to bear. She had just humiliated a young man, Malik, and now she was left standing in the wake of her own prejudice. The male officer beside her looked even more uncomfortable. His eyes darted nervously between Anthony and Deborah, unsure of how to proceed. The tension in the room was palpable. The other pilots and airport staff who had been lingering near the door now looked at one another as if waiting for someone to take control of the situation. But no one spoke. No one knew what to say, as if everyone was still processing the truth of the moment, the truth that Malik had been wronged, that Deborah had been too quick to judge, too eager to assume. Malik stood quietly, his mind racing, but his body frozen. His father was there, standing tall beside him, but the weight of the world still pressed down on his shoulders. He could feel the humiliation of the past moments seeping into his bones, but at the same time, there was a glimmer of hope. His father had arrived not just to clear his name, but to remind him of something he had always known deep down. He mattered. His dreams mattered. And no one, not even the powerful figures in this room, had the right to take that away from him. Finally, Anthony spoke again, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. "Captain Voss," he said, his gaze unwavering as he turned to Deborah, "this situation could have been handled differently. My son had every right to be here, and your actions, not just your assumptions, but your behavior were wrong." Deborah flinched slightly at his words, but she didn't dare interrupt him. Malik could see her hands trembling, the professional mask she had worn so confidently starting to crack. The silence that followed was deafening, as though the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for her response. I didn't know," Deborah muttered, her voice faltering. I thought he was—" She stopped, the words trailing off. It was clear she wasn't sure what to say next. Her attempt to justify herself seemed weak, almost desperate. Anthony's expression remained unchanged, but his eyes held a certain sorrow. "You thought he was what exactly?" he asked, his voice cool and controlled. "An outsider, a threat." The question hung in the air, sharp and pointed, because of the color of his skin, because of who you assumed he was, based on nothing more than prejudice. Deborah's face turned pale. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time, she looked small, as though the weight of her actions had collapsed the walls of authority she had so carefully built around herself. The officer who had been standing at attention beside her finally spoke, his voice unsure. "We're just following standard procedure," he said, but his words lacked conviction. He looked at Anthony and then at Malik, but his gaze quickly dropped to the floor, unable to meet either of their eyes. Malik's heart clenched in his chest. He had been blamed for something he hadn't done, treated like a criminal, for no reason other than the assumptions made about him. But now, with his father standing by his side, the truth was out there. The doubt that had clouded his mind began to dissipate. He wasn't the problem here. The real issue was the prejudices that had been so casually applied to him. "You can't just treat people this way," Anthony said, his voice filled with quiet intensity. "You can't judge a person's worth, their potential, based on nothing more than appearances and assumptions. That's not how it works." He turned his gaze toward Malik, his expression softening, and for the first time Malik felt the full weight of his father's belief in him. "Malik has done nothing wrong. He belongs here just as much as anyone else." The words were a lifeline. Malik felt the weight of his father's protection, his strength wrap around him like a shield. But even as the pressure began to lift, he knew this wasn't over. "Not yet." Deborah, still struggling to find her voice, finally spoke again, her words barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry," she muttered, her eyes avoiding Malik's. It was a hollow apology, one that didn't seem to carry any real weight, but it was all she could offer in the face of the truth. The male officer stood awkwardly still, unsure of how to respond, and the rest of the room remained eerily quiet. Malik could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the realization that what had just transpired couldn't be ignored, and the weight of the mistake they had all been complicit in was now hanging over them like a dark cloud. Anthony nodded, acknowledging Deborah's weak apology with a quiet, controlled response. "Sorry is a start, Captain," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "But it's only the beginning. There needs to be accountability for what's happened here. Not just for my son, but for anyone else who has been treated this way." Malik's mind raced as he processed his father's words. The feeling of vindication was powerful, but it was also bittersweet. The damage had been done, he had been humiliated, questioned, and judged without reason. And while he would walk out of this room with his head held high, the scar of this experience would stay with him. But there was something else he had learned in this moment, something that his father had always told him. No one could take away his dignity unless he let them. And now, standing with his father, feeling the weight of his support, Malik knew that he would never let anyone take away his sense of worth again. The room remained still, the tension unresolved, but in that stillness, Malik knew that this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The tension in the room lingered, but with every passing moment, Malik could feel it shift. The officers were still standing there, their stances less certain, but no less wary of the consequences they now realized were inevitable. The awkward silence that had followed his father's revelation wasn't helping to relieve the strain. If anything, it made things feel worse, as though they were all suspended in some uncomfortable, unresolved limbo. Malik's heart still pounded in his chest, but it was no longer the frantic, fearful thrum it had been earlier. Instead, it was a quiet rhythm of anticipation, as if the truth had already begun its work, slowly unraveling the knots that had been tied so tightly around him. Deborah, who had previously been so quick to condemn him, now stood at a distance, her eyes averted as if unable to meet Malik's gaze. She shifted uneasily, the earlier bravado slipping from her like a cloak she no longer had the strength to wear. She was no longer the powerful authority figure she had once been. Her facade had cracked, and now all that was left was the vulnerability of a woman who had been caught in her own web of assumptions. The male officer beside her cleared his throat, but his voice lacked conviction, as if he too had been rattled by what had just unfolded. The remaining pilots and airport staff, who had been standing on the sidelines, now seemed to shrink away, avoiding the conversation entirely. None of them wanted to acknowledge what had happened. None of them wanted to be the one to take responsibility for the cruelty that had been directed at Malik. Malik stood still, but now his focus was sharper. The room that had once seemed like a trap had begun to feel different. With his father by his side, he felt the certainty that the truth was on his side, and no amount of denial or discomfort from the others could take that away. But even so, he wasn't ready to let this moment pass without making sure it counted. He couldn't let this injustice go unnoticed, not just for his own sake, but for anyone else who might find themselves in a similar position. Looking at his father, Malik finally spoke, his voice low but firm, the weight of his words hanging between them. "Dad, what happens now?" The question was simple, but it carried a depth of emotion that he hadn't yet allowed himself to express. There was still so much to process, so much anger, so much frustration, but he knew his father's answer would guide him. This wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about understanding what this moment meant, about the choices they would make moving forward. Anthony looked at Malik, his eyes softening for a moment before he turned back to the group in the room. He didn't respond immediately, but his gaze swept over the officers and Deborah, his expression serious, assessing the situation with the sharp precision of someone who had seen his fair share of injustice. "What happens now is up to all of you," he said slowly, his voice carrying authority. "You'll have to answer for what's happened here. Malik shouldn't have been treated this way, and no amount of 'I didn't know' is going to make it right. There will be consequences." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence was different. It wasn't the tense quiet of a situation hanging on the edge of disaster. This silence felt more like the calm before the storm. The stillness before the storm of accountability broke over them all. Anthony's words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Deborah flinched at the idea of consequences, her eyes flickering nervously to the other officers who were now looking less confident. They had assumed they were in control of the situation, but now they saw that the power dynamics had shifted completely. The officer who had spoken most harshly to Malik earlier cleared his throat and began to speak, but Anthony cut him off with a sharp glance. "We don't need any more explanations. The damage has been done," Anthony said, his voice unwavering. "What we need now is accountability. We need to look at what went wrong here, and we need to make sure this doesn't happen again." Malik felt a wave of anger rise up within him, but he didn't let it show. He understood the gravity of what was being said, but it didn't make the sting of the injustice any easier to bear. He wanted to shout, to demand that they feel what he had felt, every ounce of the humiliation, every second of the uncertainty. But as he looked at his father, who stood tall, calm, and composed in the face of it all, Malik understood that sometimes the true fight for justice was in choosing to remain dignified when others wanted to strip it away. We'll be taking this to the higher-ups. Anthony continued his gaze, now hard as stone. The NASB will investigate this, and so will Horizon Airlines. You'll all have to answer for what happened here. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. And, Captain Voss, I'll be filing an official complaint against you for your conduct. I trust you'll have a lot of time to reflect on your actions. Deborah's face drained of color. Her lips parted slightly, but she couldn't find the words to defend herself. The realization that her career, her position might be in jeopardy, was sinking in, and she knew there was no way out of this now. Malik could see the shift in her demeanor from someone who had been so sure of herself just moments before to someone who was now desperately trying to maintain control of a situation that was no longer hers to command. The earlier disdain in her eyes was replaced with a flicker of fear. She had been caught exposed for what she was, someone who had judged Malik based on the color of his skin, and now the consequences of that prejudice were coming for her. Malik's eyes never left her, his gaze steady. For the first time, he didn't feel afraid. He didn't feel like he was fighting a battle he couldn't win. He felt instead a sense of quiet strength rising inside him, fueled by the knowledge that he had the truth on his side. The room might still be filled with people who didn't want to admit they had done wrong, but he didn't need them to. He didn't need anyone's approval anymore. The male officer who had remained silent up to this point took a hesitant step forward. "We'll begin the review process immediately," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Wait, sir." The nervousness in his tone was unmistakable. "We'll make sure this is handled properly." Anthony nodded, the action so slight it was almost imperceptible, but the finality in his gesture made it clear that there would be no backing down. "I trust you will. And this isn't just about Malik. This is about ensuring that no other young person ever has to face what he's faced here today. This is about making sure that prejudice and assumptions don't continue to govern the way we treat each other in this industry, or in any industry for that matter." Malik didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of his own worth. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more battles, more struggles against an unfair system. But as long as he had his father by his side, as long as he could hold on to his dignity, he knew he could face whatever came next. The truth had a way of coming to light, even if it took time. And no matter what, Malik wasn't going to let anyone take his place in the sky. The days that followed the confrontation in the pilot's lounge were a whirlwind. The investigation into Malik's treatment by Captain Deborah Voss and the airport security was swift but thorough. Horizon Airlines, under pressure from Malik's father and the NASB, took the matter seriously, realizing the gravity of the situation and the potential damage to its reputation if it didn't take a firm stand. The NASB launched its own investigation, looking into how such a full-hour act of racial bias had occurred in one of the most secure and prestigious areas of aviation. But for Malik, the process of seeking justice wasn't just about the official inquiries. It was about something deeper, something personal. It was about reclaiming his voice, his dignity, and his right to belong in a world that had too often tried to tell him otherwise. Each day as the investigation unfolded, Malik could feel the weight lifting off him, but it was a slow, steady process. His confidence, once shattered in that lounge, slowly began to rebuild. He didn't have to fight alone anymore. His father had stood by him, unwavering every step of the way. But now Malik understood that his fight was about more than just this moment. It was about a larger battle for fairness, equality, and the simple right to be seen for who he was, not who others assumed him to be. The media coverage of the incident, though uncomfortable for Malik, worked in his favor. Stories about his mistreatment spread like wildfire, sparking conversations across the country about racial bias in the aviation industry. Malik became a symbol of resilience and strength, a young man who had stood tall in the face of adversity, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. He was interviewed by journalists, and his story resonated with so many. He didn't just represent the injustice that had been done to him. He became the voice for others who had faced similar prejudice and discrimination, but had never had the opportunity to speak out. Malik's story gave them a platform, a reason to believe that things could change if they stood together, fought together, and never backed down from the fight for what was right. Despite the attention and the outpouring of support, Malik's path to healing wasn't immediate. There were moments when the weight of the past would rear its ugly head, when the memories of that humiliating day would threaten to undo the progress he had made. But every time that doubt crept in, Malik thought about the day his father had stood in that room with him unshaken, demanding that Malik's dignity be respected. He thought about how in that moment he had seen his father not just as a parent, but as a man who had spent his life fighting for fairness in a world that often wasn't kind. That memory, that sense of justice, fueled Malik's desire to continue. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for all the kids like him who had been overlooked, underestimated, and misunderstood. As the investigation into Captain Voss progressed, it became clear that she had made several grave mistakes. Her history of discriminatory behavior, the reports of other instances where she had targeted employees and students of color, were too much to ignore. She was placed on administrative leave while Horizon Airlines reviewed her conduct, and the NASB recommended a thorough reassessment of their diversity and inclusion policies. Malik had not only been a victim of racial prejudice, but his experience had led to an overhaul in policies meant to protect future generations as of young people, especially those from underrepresented backgrounds who aspired to work in aviation. But despite these official actions, the real victory for Malik was not in the policy changes or the media buzz. It was in his personal growth. He realized that justice wasn't just about winning a battle against the system. It was about using the pain, the hardship, and the injustice to fuel something greater. It was about using his experience to inspire others to lift them up and show them that no matter the obstacle, they could find their way to success. Malik began to speak at schools' conferences and workshops, sharing his story with others. He spoke about the power of resilience, about standing tall, even when the world seemed to be telling you that you didn't belong. He spoke about the importance of being seen, of being heard, and of the fight for equality that still raged in so many corners of society. As he stood in front of classrooms full of young students, many of whom had faced their own struggles with identity, belonging, and racial bias, Malik became a living testament to the power of perseverance. His words were a beacon of hope, a reminder that no one's dream was too big, and no one's journey was too difficult to navigate if they had the courage to keep moving forward. One day, after one of his talks, Malik was approached by a young girl who looked up to him with wide, hopeful eyes. "I want to be a pilot someday," she said shyly, "but I'm scared. I don't know if they'll let me in." Malik smiled, his heart swelling with pride. He crouched down to her level, meeting her eyes. "They might try to tell you that you don't belong. They might try to make you feel small, but you stand tall. You show them what you're made of. And you never let anyone, no matter who they are, take away your dream." The girl nodded, her eyes lighting up with a renewed sense of hope. And in that moment, Malik knew that this was why he had to keep going. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the future, about the generations that would follow in his footsteps, about the young people who would grow up knowing that they could break through the barriers others had set for them. He had become more than just a symbol of injustice. He had become a symbol of possibility. Justice had been served, and the scales had begun to balance. Captain Deborah Voss had been removed from her position, and Horizon Airlines had implemented stronger policies for diversity and inclusion, ensuring that young people like Malik would never again be subjected to the same discrimination. But for Malik, the real reward came from within. He had fought for his place in the world, not just to be acknowledged, but to be celebrated for who he was. He had used his experience to bring about change, to shift the narrative, and to remind everyone that the sky was big enough for all dreams, no matter how big or small, no matter who you were or where you came from. The journey wasn't easy, but it had forged Malik into something stronger, someone who would never back down from a fight for justice, someone who would use his voice to uplift others. As he looked up at the sky, knowing that his dreams were still ahead of him, Malik Anderson understood that this was just the beginning. His fight for justice, his journey to inspire and empower others, was a story that would continue for the rest of his life. And the sky, his sky, was waiting for him. Malik's journey is a powerful reminder that no matter who you are or where you come from, the true measure of strength lies in standing up for yourself even when the world tries to tear you down. It shows us that resilience and the courage to face adversity head-on are the keys to overcoming life's toughest challenges. His story teaches us that no matter how high the stakes are, self-respect, inner strength, and the support of those who truly believe in you can make all the difference. Malik's experience proves that true power comes from within, and when we fight for what's right, justice will always prevail. Now we want to hear from you. How would you have reacted in Malik's shoes? What does his story mean to you? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and share this video with your friends. If you want to see more inspiring stories like this, be sure to hit the subscribe button and join our community. Together, we can spread messages of strength, fairness, and hope to more people. Thank you for being here and supporting us.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.